Good evening, Executive Secretary Alice Jabana and distinguished guests. Welcome to the launch of this year's report for the Asia-Pacific SDG Partnership. I'm Sandra Han Utsaha, or Sandy. I'm an English news presenter here in Thailand, and I'm thrilled to be your facilitator. The long-standing partnership between ESCAP, ADB, and UNDP is a vital platform for delivering knowledge and fostering dialogue to support the effective implementation of the SDGs in our region. This year's report is titled Delivering a Just Transition, Advancing Decent Work, Gender Equality, and Social Protection in the Workforce. It delves into the implications of green and blue transitions of the workforce. It examines issues around readiness, productivity, gender equality, health and social protection, and offers solutions and policy recommendations to ensure that no one is left behind. Today, we will hear from senior representatives of the three partner organizations. We are honored to have with us Ms. Armida Salcia Alisjabana, Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of ESCAP, to give the opening remarks. And afterwards, our distinguished panelists will share their insights and experiences on the key issues affecting a just transition of the workforce to sustainable economies. Representing UNDP, we have Ms. Kani Wignaraja, United Nations Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. And representing ADB, we have Ms. Noelle O'Brien, Director of Climate Change. We're also privileged to welcome two expert speakers, Ms. Cynthia McDougall, Senior Research Fellow for Asia at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and also Mr. David Simmons, Chief Strategy, Sustainability, and Governance Officer at CLP Holdings Limited and Chair of the ESBN Task Force on Energy Transition. Please note that we are live streaming on YouTube, and at the end of the panel, we'll open the floor to questions from the in-person audience. Lastly, we would like to invite you to join us for a cocktail-style reception at 6:30 p.m. outside ESCAP Hall to continue the discussion and network with fellow attendees. And now, without further ado, may I please invite Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of ESCAP, Ms. Armida Salcia Alisjabana, for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Excellencies, distinguished participants, colleagues, friends, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this year's SDG Partnership Report. This is a long-standing collaboration between ESCAP, ADB, as well as UNDP. I would like to extend my sincerest appreciation to our partners for their dedication to producing this report to drive knowledge building and inform policy making. If you recall, last year's report examined the nexus between climate change, poverty, and hunger, showing how climate change exacerbates food insecurity, undermines labor productivity, and forces displacement, disproportionately affecting those who are at risk. This year's report builds on this idea, focusing on the transition to green and blue economies as a necessary step to address climate change while advancing sustainable development. However, this transition must be fair and inclusive, ensuring decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind, which is called a just transition. A just transition has the potential to generate millions of new jobs while addressing the risk of disruption to employment and livelihoods, particularly for workers in carbon-intensive industries, the informal sector, and those lacking social protection. This report collects more than 50 examples of potential solutions and good practices being implemented by countries, showcasing how a just transition to green and blue economies can be pursued on many fronts. At the core of these good practices lies several policy considerations fundamental to make this transition just and sustainable. First is that the workforce and skills development must be a priority. Preparing the workforce for emerging green and blue sectors begins with accurately forecasting labor market needs and identifying critical skills gaps. It then requires laying out the right skills development programs together with upgraded curricula, modernized training facilities, and more qualified trainers. Equally important is ensuring that training programs are accessible to all, including women, informal workers, and marginalized groups, so that no one is left behind. Secondly, stronger social protection systems are needed to mitigate the risk of transition and ensure access to essential services, for example, healthcare, reskilling opportunities, and occupational safety. With nearly half of the region's population lacking social protection, expanding coverage, including for informal workers and those in transitional sectors, through a mix of schemes such as unemployment benefits and universal health care, will be key to building resilience and protecting livelihoods. And thirdly, gender equality must be at the core of this transition. A just transition cannot succeed unless women have equal opportunities to participate in and benefit from the green and blue economies. Advancing these priorities is not merely technical, it is profoundly humane. The case studies presented in the report make clear that achieving a just transition demands action and the right means to implement them at scale. It calls for well-coordinated and integrated policy making across multiple sectors as well as jurisdictions. It requires adequate financial resources to manage short-term transition costs, recognizing that this investment will yield long-term social as well as economic benefits. It demands strong social dialogue to ensure that the voices of workers, communities, and marginal groups are not only heard, but actively shape decision-making, and it needs international as well as regional partnership to support national efforts, national initiatives, scaling up development finance, establishing cross-border collaboration framework, and sharing best practices. So with that, I look forward to your further insights, especially from our esteemed panelists, and I hope the report serves as a valuable references, resources to inform policies and drive action. Thank you very much, and I wish you a lively and successful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary Alice Jabana. And before we speak with our expert panel, we have a video to share with you.
The Asia-Pacific region emits around 60% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Over 50% of the world's material footprint originates in the region. The alarming impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events, food insecurity, and increased poverty, continue to unfold. These impacts disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, the poor, remote and indigenous communities, and women and children, among others. Additionally, hundreds of millions of workers in the region depend on natural systems for their livelihoods, making them highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. A transition to green and blue economies could mitigate these impacts while generating millions of new jobs across the region. However, for those currently dependent on carbon and resource-intensive sectors, there will be livelihood disruptions and workforce challenges to overcome. A just transition of the workforce that is fair and inclusive is needed. This requires solutions and enhanced policies that focus on upskilling the workforce, that promote the inclusion of women, informal workers, migrants, and other vulnerable populations into the workforce, and transition-ready social protection systems that ensure income security and improve access to climate-resilient health services. With the right policies, solutions, and commitment, the Asia-Pacific region can accelerate a just transition that delivers environmental sustainability, reduces inequalities, and improves livelihoods while leaving no one behind.
And with that, it is now the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time for us to hear from our esteemed panelists. So Ms. McDougall, Ms. Widnaraja, Ms. O'Brien, and Mr. Simmons, it's an honor to have you here with us, and thank you for spending time to discuss such a significant topic. So let's begin by setting the context. I'd like to address Ms. Widnaraja first. The report deems accelerated transition to green and blue economies necessary to deliver the Paris Agreement. What policy challenges do you foresee in the implementation of this transition, and how can we address them for coherence across policies at different levels?
Thank you, Sandy. And I know this is evening. I always worry when there's a video because I feel I should hand out popcorn as well. But I hope that some of you do take a read of the actual report, because it covers not just the analysis that ESCAP, ADB, and UNDP did together, but it also covers case studies from your countries and really tries to unpack what works, what doesn't work for those serious about conducting these transitions and carrying them out now. So Sandy, in terms of challenges, I would say that this report is very honest in regarding the main issues, that this is not without cost. And the biggest cost here, or the disruption, if I can call it, is that it does hurt existing jobs, particularly in the informal sector, but also for those in high fossil fuel intensive industry and agriculture. However, it's very clear that when you work the numbers, you're going to get, at least in our region, a net of about 20 million new jobs created just in the few years that the transition happened. So even during the pain, you're creating new jobs. Now, a second adjustment is that the ripple effects, but also the advantages, are for those who actually do this as multi-sector. The adjustments have to be made cross-sector. And that's where I think the coherence is going to be key. So 3 quick actions. One is, please run the numbers. And we do these readiness assessments, and for countries interested, we've just done it for Indonesia. We've done it with China across some large economic sectors. Very important to run the numbers to understand how this works in terms of impact. Second, invest now in some of the very specific capacities and new skill areas that are pointed out by the report, particularly in the tech ed and new energy fields. And last but not least, the countries that are really moving fast in these transitions are putting together what I would call SWAT teams. That's not what we call it in the report, but these are problem-solving teams that can really come in to help ministries, sectors, institutions, private and public sector, see where some of the immediate issues are and really look for solutions together. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Widnaraja. So run the numbers to see impact, invest now, and consult your SWAT team. All right. So let me now ask ADB. Ms. O'Brien, how can multilateral development banks like ADB help address the social and economic disruptions caused by this transition? And How can MDBs work with other important actors, such as governments and the private sector, on this?
Thank you very much, and for all the partnership with ADB on this body of work. I will not be quite as succinct as Connie, because there is a lot of work that we've been doing on just transition over the last couple of years. As I think it's first of all in the analysis that we've done, we see that just transition is going to be a factor in all sectors, from energy, transport, waste, forestry, agriculture, fisheries, tourism. And that there are going to be both the job creation, but also the need for livelihoods support within all of these. The partnerships and the meaningful engagement with different stakeholders from both government and private sector will be absolutely critical. We see that the speed and the transformations that are needed are beyond the capacities of government to handle by themselves. And we need all stakeholders to deliver transformations rapidly. So we don't see that the public finance will be enough in this space, but also that it will be essential to bring in other sources of finance to help with these transitions. But we also feel that it's such importance on placing emphasis that the transition needs to be just. So from the MDB perspective, we've been active since 2021, when the MDBs jointly published the Just Transition High-Level Principles to guide our financing and other support for a just transition. And at COP29 late last year, we made significant progress in transforming these principles into 3 pillars. And that is strengthening governance capacities and building the knowledge base. Secondly, making education, skills, and livelihood transition ready. And thirdly, supporting economic diversification and productivity and building low carbon and resilient infrastructure. We see that all of these 3 pillars are essential for both our climate and sustainability goals. Now at ADB, we have been focused on 4 particular areas. The first being just developing the operational support to mainstream just transition into ADB's operations, policies, and strategies. Secondly, we've been working on strengthening our own institutional capacity and harmonizing efforts with other MDBs to deliver this just transition support to our developing member countries. Thirdly, it is providing knowledge, leading innovations, and strengthening collaboration with other stakeholders and development partners. So this is includes work with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the GFANZ, but also the support we provide into the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in Indonesia and Vietnam and other countries which are emerging. Mobilizing resources has also a critical aspect because this is going to cost countries. We launched a Just Transition support platform in 2022 to build the capacity of our DMCs to strategically plan and finance for a just transition. And we're currently still raising finances for that. I think we're in the range of about 4 million already. Secondly, ADB has been working on what is known as the Energy Transition Mechanism. This is a process to support the early phase out of coal, and just transition has to be a critical part in that process. It has to work with the plant workers who are directly employed by the plant, but also on the indirect, so service providers. And if we look at the early phase out of coal, on a larger level, then it obviously also links in with coal extraction. We've also established a just transition financing facility to bring together the different financing partners, including private sector, to drive those solutions. So the last thing I'll talk about is one of the other bodies of work is we have a community resilience partnership program. This is a program within ADB that is focused on poverty, climate, and gender nexus, which brings together efforts on a range of aspects, but including the social protection system. So sorry, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I mean, there's so much taking place at ADB, I can see, and it just underscores the importance of collaboration. All right, let's move on to Ms. Madogal now. I'd like to ask you about, well, for the green and blue transition to work for all. The report advocates for prioritizing gender equality. How can gender transformative change unlock the transition's benefits, and what examples are there of how this can be done practically?
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy. And warm greetings to everyone who's hanging in there at this point in the day. It's a real pleasure to be able to join this very rich conversation that we've had today. I thought I would tackle this question a little bit on the why and then on the how. And since it's late in the day, I wanted to complement the excellent facts and the richness of those with first a case example, a little story that has stuck in my mind since I first heard it some years back in a form of green transition that was taking place. And this was where a program had resources, had investments to make in multiple communities, and in this community in particular, they approached the leaders, they approached the committees that were making the decisions, they had a robust discussion, they made a decision that seemed exactly right at the time, and they landed on an investment of 1,000 high-value trees that would down the road bring an income to the community. It sounded great. 6 months later, the outcome was 1,000 dead seedlings. What happened? I can imagine people are already percolating a little bit. Are there technical aspects of what happened? Possibly. But the driver of the failure in this case was the decision-making. The decision-making process was primarily the already more powerful established leaders of the community. In this case, they were men. The women, they had a few seats at the table, but were essentially there in secretarial roles and other capacities. And as an outcome, the decision was really good with the knowledge and perspective of the folks making the decision, but the women could have brought to the table the fact that there was actually a fuel crisis, a water crisis, and other priorities needed to be invested in this moment for it to work. Not to mention that their engagement, their participation was in the form of post-decision voluntary work in the nursery, which they couldn't carry out because of the high work burdens. We already heard today 4 to 5 times the amount of work in unpaid care carried by women over men in the region. So robust as it wasn't robust for all genders. Similarly, the low-income households weren't involved in the decision, and had they been at the table, they could have shifted to bring issues like the fact that the slopes needed stabilization, and fast-growing bamboo and other activities would have protected them and the community from the disasters that ensued over the next 6 to 12 months. So the story is, it's just a quick one, and it's community scale, but it really applies to our blue and green transition as well, I think, because it tells us not only what we hear a lot, that if we're not proactively inclusive and equitable and just, we will retrench or even worsen inequalities, but it also tells us that the outcomes will be weak or even fail. They will be unsuccessful if we don't take the just part of the just transition seriously. So if that's on the table, let me just quickly round up on the how question, and my takeaway is we need to think in layers and we need to act at the roots. In layers, we've heard some wonderful expressions of some statistics and important data in the report about labor gap, labor force participation, and that there's a gender gap there. Very important, but if we dig a little deeper, we hear also about the pay gaps, wage gaps, the sticky floor or the glass ceilings, gender-based violence, which we've heard about today, dropout of STEM and IT sectors by women, early child and forced marriage, all very important, but we can dig even deeper. And that's where we start to see the systemic aspects, the drivers, and in particular, two of them have come up today and are critical. The unequal division of labor between genders, in particular unpaid work. And I didn't say women's care burdens because it's not a women's issue, it's an everyone issue. This imbalance is an issue for everyone. Secondly, unequal decision making, as we heard in the story. The imbalances there matter, and we can dig even deeper to the harmful gender norms that constrain, that they're the unspoken aspects of what we think men should be and do, what we think women should be and do. And those are, in a sense, they're the blueprint for the house we build. If the other parts are the foundation, decision making, care, those, and distribution of work, those are the foundations. But the blueprint is these gender norms. And if we don't address those through going deeper than gender responsive activities, which are critical, gender budgeting, gender analysis, and transition plans, but we need to get to those aspects that engage with men and women co-owning gender equality, that engage with surfacing harmful gender norms and harmful systems, and shifting those, we will ultimately be recreating the same house, even though we're calling it a transition.
Thank you for that. A lot of work needs to be done. All right. I'd like to move on to Mr. Simmons now. Companies are typically the biggest employers in the key sectors affected by the transition, and requirements and changing skills impact them first. Is the private sector moving fast enough in identifying and anticipating the new skills needs?
Well, I think when we talk about energy transition, first and foremost, I think the latest statistics show that we've crossed 1.5 degrees warming already. So when it comes to the transition, I think it's fair to say that none of us are moving fast enough. Government, policymakers, the private sector, and consumers. We all need to do more. But specifically in terms of addressing the skills transition required for a just transition, I actually think companies are working pretty effectively in this area. It is an essential element of remaining competitive for companies, and you can see this when you read company annual reports and sustainability reports, for those of you who have the boredom to do so. There are some very interesting pieces of information in there about this topic, but specifically I think it's clear in many companies, specifically in the energy sector, that this issue is a competitive threat that is getting sufficient attention. Having said that, we've talked a lot already on this panel about partnership and collaboration, and recognizing that not one group can do everything. And I think it's important to recognize that the private sector or companies can do some things well, can contribute to others, and in some areas they require quite a lot of policy and government support. So if I look at the experience from the companies that I'm associated with and have seen through the various networks that I belong to, I think for vocational training, technical training, reskilling workforces, they're the sort of things that the private sector can do very effectively, very efficiently, and probably are in the best place to do so. When it comes to things like the engineering and higher technical skills that are required, that is where a longer term commitment is needed. Collaboration with universities to make sure that the right pipeline of students are coming in the right areas to meet the needs of companies, and that does require some planning and longer term commitment. Some companies do it, some don't. And then on things like societal norms and gender roles and things of that nature, which can restrict the workforce in a number of areas, corporates have a role to play there, but it's of limited impact relative potentially to what others can do. And so I think recognizing that partnership and collaboration with others is critical, is an essential ingredient here. And having said all of that, I do think that across all of those areas, companies can contribute quite significantly. And it starts with having a disciplined approach to looking at the needs of the future. That's a materiality assessment that a lot of companies do as part of their sustainability exercises these days. Done well, it can really help provide a pathway for the sort of thinking and involvement in retraining and identification of skills gaps that organizations have in particular areas. And then investing in learning and development and supporting employees in developing that culture of continuous learning, which is going to be essential as we see some jobs disappear, either through energy transition or technology change, or from geographical dislocation, and so that the employees themselves are participating in managing their careers, and encouraging that is a critical aspect too. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons, and thank you for reemphasizing the need for us all to do more, and that no one group can do everything all alone. Let's talk about tackling relevant challenges and opportunities now, and I'd like to do that by asking Ms. O'Brien first. What skills are most important for the workforce to transition to more sustainable economies, and how can we address the region's significant workforce readiness gaps and disparities?
Thank you. And maybe just picking up where David has left off. I mean, I think we start with just a whole enhancement of the environmental and climate literacy. So the kind of practices that are needed for sustainability and how we can implement them in various sectors. So one thing alone might be how we deal with heat stress and particularly in urban contexts, and what are the solutions in very stressful urban contexts, which we are facing during each heat season at the moment. The second area would be, as has also been mentioned, far greater emphasis on the STEM education, but also on problem solving and innovation and the analytical skills that are needed to impact and track progress, effective communication, and collaboration skills. One of the areas that ADB invests in is in the technical vocational education and training. One such example is in Punjab, where we're working with strengthening the TVET sector to support economic prosperity and job creation. We are expanding the use of competency-based training and assessment, and helping to develop TVET centers of excellence as part of that investment. One such sector where we see the need is obviously where we have investments in renewables, particularly in solar, and ensuring that we have technicians at the various levels in place to install for operations and maintenance. And so there's a whole range of expertise that's required, and how do we develop and establish the guidance on those. I think we see similar practices, particularly in relation to e-vehicles. And we see particularly, I'm based in the Philippines, and we see particularly the challenges where you have a public transport system that has been in place for so many years, and how do you start to transition that? But also, just to note that there are some strategies to prepare the workforce that are set out in the report, and these involve the education and training, the public-private partnerships, and the policies and incentives and community engagement as part of that. So I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yes, we all need to take a look at the report to learn more. I'd like to ask Ms. Narajan now, how can we ensure that the transition leaves no one behind and that it increases opportunities for those at risk of exclusion, such as women and informal workers?
Well, let's be very honest. Much of development and all kinds of development and progress as we know it has always left certain groups behind. So to wake up and say, oh, well, will these transitions leave people behind? Well, we've got to look at who we've left behind in the first place, and that may be a good place to start. Now, in our region, you don't have to look very far because girls and women have been left behind in every country. Some more than others, but in every country, the data is very, very clear on who gets left behind. A second group, if you wish, or category is what we kind of label as informal workers or informality. Now, when did informality mean lack of legal protections, lack of dignity, lack of basic respect, insurance, a hope to move forward? So somehow this issue of informality and informal workers has also kind of taken on this category of not being protected and respected. And yet in this region, these are millions and millions of workers who don't have social protection or any legal protection for that matter. Now, to avoid some of this as we move into these transitions, maybe this is a good wake-up call. Maybe it's a moment to make some of these structural changes that we've been avoiding for so long. So to pick a few things to start with, there are countries in this region that have started providing legal protection for informal sector workers. In fact, Cambodia is a good example of this. Second, what happened to the quality of our public education system? In many years, decades past, we would not have thought twice about saying, actually, we can add really quality STEM education to our public education system and it's going to get picked up. How many countries today have pride and confidence in their public education systems that say if we introduce STEM for both boys and girls from a very early age and consistently keep this through the education cycle, that this is going to happen. So this is something that sadly you've seen education budgets just get smaller and smaller and smaller when this is the one that has to go counter-cyclical if we're going to actually see prosperity not just in transitions but particularly during transitions. I would say the largest group that gets left behind and really almost gets replaced, if you wish, is that group in the middle, the middle age group where the big effort has to indeed be in reskilling. And there, to be done at the speed and the scale that requires, there is a cost, but it's an investment that comes with a high value return. And the last I would say is those not who get resettled, but those who get displaced. And that is the older group of workers. And again, this is something that is very clear in the report. There's no country that can really manage this without displacing that older group of workers. However, they can be the ones where the scaling of social protection and insurance, particularly health insurance, which again in our region is still abysmal, if that can be moved up, then they stand a chance of actually having a dignified life after working for so many years without this kind of protection. So the gains of a just transition are there. It just has to be that governments, private sector have to have the courage of investing upfront in order to then pay out for these, because these dividends come a little bit later.
Thank you very much. So many have been left behind already, and the clock is ticking, and we need to get a move on it, right? Start now. All right. Mr. Simmons, what strategies are there to reskill workers in traditional energy sectors and integrate them into the green economy? And could you also share some regional examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. I think I'll start with some examples from my own company because they speak volumes about some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities are out there to afford our people with a just transition. So let me start with an example with our power station that we have in Australia, in the state of Victoria. It's your Lawn Power Station. It's about 50 years old. It's in a Latrobe Valley of Victoria, which is home to a lot of coal-fired generation, which is all slated to close. And it's an area that has already gone through quite a considerable trauma through transition in the past when that sector was privatized several decades ago, and many thousands of jobs were lost. And there was very little, I think it's fair to say, effort involved at that point in providing a just transition for the workers who were displaced through that period of time. So if you fast forward to today, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We have that power station has a coal mine that feeds the power station, so it has quite a significant workforce attached to it that is required right up until the final days of its operation. So we took a decision early on that the best thing that we could do was to provide as much notice of closure as possible. So in 2021, we, in conjunction with the Victorian state government, reached a deal in which we would close the power station in 2028, giving the whole of our workforce and the local community and all of the industries that survive around it a period of 7 years notice that this change was coming. And as part of that, we've invested already up over 10 million Australian dollars towards what we've called a transition fund for our workforce to engage in career counselling, retraining, and other financial related services for those who are approaching retirement, to be able to make decisions for themselves about how best to manage the 7 years until the power station closes. We've also, as part of that, engaged in arrangements with a number of other employers in the region to try and provide opportunities for secondments and other job opportunities for our staff, to have a diversity of choice for future work. And importantly for us, when we looked at how we provide the replacement infrastructure that is absolutely needed to ensure the energy security in that part of the country, we've also tried to prioritize installing infrastructure in that part of the country in order to provide additional jobs that we could also redeploy our staff to. So we have invested further in battery energy storage projects, as well as fast start gas turbines that are incredibly important to integrate renewables into the system. So that's an Australian example. We also have in Hong Kong something quite different, which is a workforce who is also in transition as we in Hong Kong move away from coal towards natural gas, and ultimately to nuclear and other imports from the mainland. And that requires a whole different skill set for the workforce in Hong Kong. When you think about Hong Kong as a market, a lot of the young people don't have much choice when it comes to these sorts of employment opportunities outside of existing industry. it's essentially a financial services market the industry has largely left. And so it's incredibly important that we provide an opportunity for staff who will be displaced through that transition, and indeed for others in the community who don't have access to the sort of education opportunities that are typically provided in Hong Kong, which is a formal tertiary education, to have technical training and vocational training that will provide the skills which are going to be essential for the network infrastructure that will be a part of that transition. So we established in 2017 a Power Academy, which was designed to do just that, to train up people, our own staff in different skills, but also others within the community who would be able to then have a qualification issued through that academy that would be transferable to others in the region as well. And that's proven very successful in terms of the number of people that have accessed it. And there's a lot of stories which I would tell if we had more time, Sandy, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. It is very encouraging to hear that companies like yours are doing things like this to help lessen the impact for people who are disrupted. And hopefully you have the chance to share more of what you're doing so other companies are encouraged to follow suit. So Ms. McDougall, let's talk about the role that social protection and healthcare play in just transition. Can you tell us about that?
So this is a very easy question to answer. If anybody has read the report, it's actually spelled out just beautifully in a sentence that I will read out. Healthy and secure people are better able to navigate changes and seize new opportunities. And it's very simple, but it really cuts to the chase. And it also says to us, I think, that this is not social protection and healthcare as a new thing to help a new transition. This is exactly the same multiplier effect or leverage point, as you will, that we need for adaptive capabilities, for climate resilience. It's all the same stuff that we need, not just for a good life for everyone, but to survive and thrive the situation we're in. And so I just wanted to highlight 3 challenges and a couple of ways forward, and I'm really pulling on the report here. Some of the challenges that come out very clearly, as the co-panelists have shared already. One is informal employment, which has many advantages in terms of flexibility for many people, but 2/3 of workers in Asia-Pacific are currently in informal employment. That's about 1.3 billion people. And as was raised already, that means also very little in the way, if anything, in terms of safety nets, in terms of legal protections and more. And it also means that they're outside the system. Even if the money and social protection systems are in place, they're not necessarily easy to engage in that system. Demographics have come up as well today, and this is a key point. There is in many countries in Asia-Pacific an aging population. What I learned from the report was on the other end of the spectrum, the percentage of youth in Asia-Pacific that are called NEET, not in employment, education, or training, is about 20%. That's about 137 million youth in the region that are outside of these things, and 71% of those are young women. So how to make sure they are engaged and supported through social protection systems is a big challenge, combined with this aging population. Lastly, cross-border migration has come up as well. How can social protection and healthcare systems travel with people? Mobility, when it's safe and voluntary, can be a very constructive livelihood strategy. I know that myself as someone who's just moved to Bangkok from Malaysia. And yet it's a little bit unknown territory. So the good news is that I'll just round up with a couple of points from the report on ways forward. I think there's some very clear opportunities in the area of universal basic protection and some good experiments coming up in the region around basic income guarantees, universal health care coverage. And Thailand, I believe, has already seen not just reduced out-of-pocket expenses, but increased labor force productivity, care infrastructure investments. And here I think there's opportunity to think outside the box a little bit and make sure that mental health care doesn't fall outside of those frameworks as this universal basic protection can advance. Some good advances have been named in the report around migrants, in particular around Social Security. I think we heard already increased legal protection has come up in some countries, and the possibility of Social Security being available for migrant domestic workers as they cross borders. So I think there's some good mechanisms to play with, and the report shares a few of those. The third part of this three-legged chair, if you will, is the sector-specific investments and support, so the active labor markets programs. And here, retraining and skills have been reinforced. Public works have been less mentioned today, but I think are an important opportunity. And I wanted to underscore as well that all of this way forward, universal basic protection, legal protections for migrant workers, and sector-specific investments are out of reach at the moment, in part because of financing. And here's where I think, as folks raised today, we need to start looking at the bigger question of how are global debt systems impacting on the ability to move forward with effective social protection and healthcare, and what can be done about it, not in 2 decades, but what can be done about it now in the sprint to 2030.
Thank you very much for bringing up all those points. So obviously the report itself has so much to offer, and I sincerely hope that the partner organizations are able to disseminate that information to as many people as possible. I will do my part. I will be reporting on this panel and the forum, of course, in my news program. I'd like to move on now to the question and answer session. I feel that we've learned so much from our panelists, and I'd like to open the floor up now to the delegates to see if you would like to ask anything further of our panelists. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm speaking from a trade union perspective, and we're the Public Services International, the global union that represents the workers who work in the power stations you've been talking about. And as you might know, just transition is a concept that trade unions developed and lobbied for many years. And that's why we have this expression in the Paris Agreement and the Just Transition Work Plan as part of a COP. So I have a couple of questions, I guess, around how the work, particularly of the ADB, is seen through the concept of a just transition without social dialogue being mentioned, or trade unions being mentioned as the foundation of a just transition. The comments, I think it's David, isn't it, that David made, is actually a good example. I was surprised to, be in agreement there with the private sector representative. This example that he's provided includes our members at the Yalom Power Station. We also have members at the, in Indonesia at PLN, where I believe the ADB is also targeting some of the work that was mentioned, and in other countries. But the example from Australia provides evidence that privatisation was a disaster for the community. There was no transition, no just transition, of course, as David mentioned. And the just transition, or the authority that has been set up, is co-governed with trade unions. The government of that state worked with trade unions, looking at that specific, as was mentioned, long-term transition. But in many places, you will see that trade unions are not prepared to engage in the conversation about transitioning out of fossil fuels. Firstly, because it comes with privatisation, a threat of privatisation. And workers don't want to necessarily work in fossil fuels. They're not saying we must work in fossil fuels. They want a good job. They want a unionised job and a public sector job. And what's being put on the table, particularly by the ADB and other international financial institutions, is not a secure long-term job. It's not a public sector job, and nor is it a unionised job. So we're very happy, absolutely, to work with governments and others on a just transition when we can talk about public sector renewables that are managed by public sector workers who are unionised. And there are examples of those. And coming back to the Victorian example, the government made a commitment to actually bring back a public sector energy provider that had previously been privatised, and now renewables will thankfully be a part of a state electricity commission, which we very much welcome. And we hope that other governments around the world look at this model of public sector renewables. There is finance for it because it's financed by the state. All of our energy is paid for by consumers and eventually financed by the state, and often through the most disadvantageous contracts with private sector providers. And it's clear that the state can provide it, often at a lower cost and a more reliable cost than the private sector can. So I really hope that those involved with this program will, first of all, think about how to engage trade unions more meaningfully in a just transition, and also look at the value that the public sector can have in building a renewable future. Thank you.
So I will just make one comment, but with time and also colleagues are more immediately involved in this, but with ADB is involved in conversations with trade unions on the work that we're doing on just transition. So we can take the conversation otherwise aside, but there is a dialogue with trade unions as part of the process.
Thank you. And actually, we are quickly running out of time. So, we have one more question? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen Tobin and Ken Shawa from ILO. And look, let me first start by congratulating the authors on this very timely report. Something we've been kind of following through, I think, the process, so congratulations on this. I think maybe this was hinted at a little bit, when we talk a lot about net gains, I think, as economists.
I'm sorry, could you speak closer to the microphone? Thank you.
Sure. Again, we're just very quick congratulations, I think, to the authors, Stephen Tobin and Ken Shawa from the International Labour Organization. I think this was hinted at a little bit, but, we talk quite often as economists, of which I consider myself one, net gains. But the reality is that quite often, those that are disrupted or displaced are not in a position to be the ones to take up these new opportunities, putting aside skills upgrading. And I think we've talked a little bit here about livelihoods and the importance of social protection for those that are unable or not in a position geographically, skill-wise, to take up these new opportunities. But we have to do more. It's just not enough that income sort of support for even someone who's 50 or 55 or even approaching retirement has actually quite often failed in other areas where we've seen sort of industrial restructuring. And so I'm wondering if some of the authors maybe could elaborate a little bit on going beyond just livelihood support and what that sort of means for kind of, to the previous intervention, how we can help these people get decent work in other areas in their location rather than maybe just, beyond what's sort of being recommended. Thank you.
Thank you to the sister agency over there, ILO, and who does a lot of work in Tibet and other fields, including having the trade unions as a key member, and reminds us all that the stakeholder dialogues are absolutely critical. To your point, as I had mentioned before, I think a lot of people do get left behind, and they're not. This is not just about inner transition. If we look at development across the board, we've seen those who have had, and particularly informality, that actually don't get captured, whether it's in a transition to a blue or green economy or any other form of transition. What we have seen in countries beyond trying to reskill, and particularly if you're around 55, 60 and above, is literally to speak to the issue of having a basic income, a guaranteed basic income that does take one through these periods where you are looking for other work, but may not be the preferred candidates in many countries for the education, reskilling, etc., that might be available. One might also not really put one's hand up and say, this is exactly what I want. So options that actually support insurance, support unemployment benefits, support basic income benefits are as important as looking at trying to see if new jobs, there's no magic wand that's going to create a new industry. But governments that are planning this, the readiness assessments show that the ones who are planning this better are indeed seeing that in some areas where there will be a greater loss of jobs that were heavy, either agriculture or industry, fossil fuel driven, are looking to see whether new areas or new service sector employment, other types of work can be brought to those areas. Never an easy match, and there's no kind of rainbow hue we can put on this, but it is going to be something that in those impact assessments there's a better chance to make sure that those who are then dropped off or left behind have the option of new employment should they choose to take it.
Thank you, ma'am. I see we have one more delegate with a comment or question.
Thank you very much. It was a very insightful presentation, and I'm Prim from the Children and Youth. I would like to ask about the impact on the marginalized communities, like for the children and youth, and could the just
Could you speak more closely to the microphone? Thank you.
And could the just transition be able to deliver without just getting more money, or how could we better partner with more people, with partnerships, and to have a development justice, like because developing countries in terms of climate finance that we need to invest in, it would be how could we accelerate just transition with other methods like technologies, with partnership with people, with indigenous knowledge, like for example, how can we learn, how can we love, to reserve the roots of the life, the roots of our life, right? And also the roots of our wisdom that benefits people as well in terms of just transition. Thank you.
I think it's an outstanding question, and I don't have many answers, but I just wanted to bounce off of what you said. First, just to say to keep asking that question, and I think we all need to keep asking questions like that. I was going to say that I think the way forward is exactly to start finding the ideas in the policies, in the plans, in the strategies, and the investments that are not mirror images of what we've already been doing. So in climate finance, outside the box, things would include global wealth tax. To me, that's a really interesting new mechanism. We talked about capacity and social dialogue, and I think that we're not talking enough about capacity building also being the sharing of traditional indigenous knowledge as appropriate, including from older generations to younger generations, and between communities as needed, and being recognized and valued in these, we talked about social dialogue spaces. They're still often very linear, and so to open up social dialogue so that it's recognizing multiple forms of knowledge, multiple ways of knowing, multiple sciences. And I think, to be honest, that's going to take a lot of capacity development for everyone, people who design, who lead the processes, who participate. We have to be more curious and better able to understand each other and to respectfully move forward. That I'm hoping that someone will raise the foundational point of rights, but I think that a cornerstone of my answer to your question is around rights, everything from human rights to environmental rights, tenure rights, intergenerational rights, and rights of nature, as if they are well formed and developed and locally led, I think are very powerful ways forward that are already there. We just need to understand what's working, what's not, when, where, why, and how, and then be a little bold. Great question.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that's a wrap. I don't see any more cards up. So we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for offering your insights and experiences on these critical issues. And I'd also like to thank everyone here in attendance for your engagement and commitment to these pressing concerns. Together, we can ensure that the workforce of tomorrow is resilient, fair, and capable of meeting the demands of greener, more inclusive economies. And that concludes the launch of this year's Asia-Pacific SDG Partnership Report. Please do join us outside the hall for the reception, where you can network with fellow attendees and also continue this discussion to ensure that no one is left behind. I'm Sandra Han Utsaha, and it's been a pleasure being your moderator. Thank you, and good evening.